Hey y'all, welcome to Sandy's Library. I'm Sandy.
And I'm Sara. In today's video, we're gonna wrap up my great-grandparents' story.
And don't forget about our dogs, y'all. And the cat, too. They can be noisy sometimes, so please ignore them. Okay, so let's go ahead and wrap up our half-cousin's biography of Sissy. And I'll have some more things to add after that.
Sissy died after a lengthy illness on March 14th, 1977. She was 80 years old.
That lengthy illness was Parkinson's disease, and it came with full-blown dementia. She was diagnosed around the time that I was born, yet she still managed to raise me, along with my older half-brother and my first cousin Kathy. I don't know how anyone can claim to write someone's biography and fail to mention this generous deed. But here we are. And y'all, by the time I was about 13 or 14 years old, my grandmother had no idea who I was. Oh, she knew she was related to me. She just didn't know how. Most of the time, she thought I was Kathy.
Sissy was also quite vain. My mom has said many times all us grandkids were taught to call her Sissy. They were never brave enough to call her Grandma, Granny, or anything remotely suggestive of being old. No.
One of my earliest memories of Sissy was when I was 3 or 4 years old. Me standing with her in the kitchen while she's stirring a pot on the stove and she's teaching me to count to 10.
Sissy also told some wild stories in the early 1970s as the dementia progressed. She thought my grandmother Florence was laid up in the front bedroom of the house, but she thought it was a hospital room. She would tell my mom and other family members, "Don't you see all the machines and wires that she's hooked up to?"
All true. And we would ask her to describe the machines, but she had trouble detailing them for us. All she could say was that it was like nothing she had ever seen. I'm not sure what that was about, but I wonder if she was seeing into the future. 'Cause see, in 2008, when my mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, she spent the last few weeks of her life in a hospital hooked up to machines. So, while everybody thought Sissy was crazy back then, now I have to wonder if she was seeing snippets of the future.
After all the stories in earlier videos about Willie and Grandma Fuller's supernatural abilities, it wouldn't surprise me a bit.
Our half-cousin talks a bit about my grandfather after he wraps up Sissy's bio, and we'll get to that. But the best stuff he left out. And to be fair, though, how could he have known about these stories since he did not ask myself, Uncle Lawrence, or Aunt Catherine for any input on Sissy's biography? Oh, sure, he asked Grandpa about some of the things Aunt Allie had told him, but Grandpa was never one to offer up information. You could ask him a direct question, and he'd either tell you the truth, or he'd make up a good lie if the truth threatened the family's honor. But he was never going to give away family secrets. So our half-cousin probably would have gotten more information if he had included some of the younger generations from the family, is all I'm saying.
If he had, he would have heard about this story, which my mom, Uncle Lawrence, and Aunt Catherine all talked about. Around 1940-ish, Sissy came down with this mysterious illness, which the doctors never identified, but she died in the hospital.
Grandpa said all color had left her body and it had grown cold to the touch.
About 30 minutes after she had been pronounced dead, they were in fact getting ready to take her down to the morgue when she started breathing again. The doctors were certain that she'd have severe brain damage when she regained consciousness due to all that time her brain had spent without oxygen.
But nope. When she did regain consciousness, she was in complete possession of her faculties. And this is what she said happened to her while she was dead.
She reported that she found herself in an office environment in what she perceived to be a lobby of sorts. She was alone except for a woman in business attire sitting at the only desk in the room. The woman advised her to take a seat among the chairs along the wall by the door and that someone would be with her shortly.
Sissy said that while she waited, she was overcome by this incredible sense of peace. She said it was the most peaceful that she'd ever felt in her entire life.
And after a few minutes, two men emerged from a door inside the room. Both men were decked out in business suits. As they approached Sissy, they smiled. One said to her, "It's not time for you to be here. You have to go back." To which Sissy inquired, "But why? It's so peaceful here." They told her, "Your work on Earth is not finished yet. You will be needed."
Well, I guess so. Because in the late 1940s, my cousin Kathy was born. Sissy raised her from a baby. In 1953, my half-brother, Larry Joe, was born prematurely. Sissy raised him from a baby. And y'all know my story. Sissy raised me from a baby, too. So, yeah, her work wasn't finished yet. She was definitely needed. And I'd just like to point out that her version of the afterlife is quite different than the picture that religion paints.
Sissy would not grow gray gracefully either. Her hair was always dyed, never showing a speck of gray. My mom learned how to dye Sissy's hair when she was about 11 years old. She also shaved the back of her grandfather's neck, too, on Sunday mornings before church. By then, Sissy's hand was too shaky to do it.
I was always amazed that Grandpa trusted me at about 11 years old with a razor. Kathy did these things until she got married the year I turned 11. Then it became my job.
In the early 1970s, Sissy's health went downhill exceedingly fast. By the time she died in 1977, she was a mere shell of her former self.
In all the photos from the 70s, she looks so tired to me. And I don't know how she lived for 20 years with this nasty, awful disease. I'm only a few years in with my early stage issues, and I can't imagine dealing with this for 20 years. No. My grandmother was 1 in a million, y'all. I remember going to the Williams family reunion in 2003, along with my own family. And it was the first time I'd attended in over 20 years. Yeah, I was out living life. Didn't have time for family. What a dumbass I was.
So we're at the family reunion back in 2003. Johnny Ray Parrott has us all introduce ourselves and tell everyone which Williams sibling we descend from. So my mom goes first. She says, "It's me, Sandra. I'm Viola Williams Phillips' granddaughter." Next in line is Uncle Lawrence, and he says, "Phillips." Our cousin Mike Curry was also there. He was the grandson of Allie Williams, Sissy's sister, and Roy Phillips, Grandpa's brother. Mike follows suit and says Phillips as well. Johnny Ray says, "Now wait a minute. You've got to be specific about which Phillips you're talking about. We're not going to let you claim Aunt Sis."
Poor Mike. There's nothing like telling someone their Phillips is better than yours. But that's the way it was. Everybody loved Sissy. Aunt Allie, not so much.
Sissy was a beautiful and gentle person until you made her mad. Then you were likely to get chased around the outside of the house with the broom.
Yep. I witnessed this firsthand when I was about 8 years old. And it was the first time I ever met my mother. She and her third husband, that we are aware of, came for a visit with 4 kids in tow. They were 5, 4, 3, and 2 years of age, 2 girls and 2 boys. On the particular day that I recall, it was raining, and I was sitting at the kitchen table doing my homework. My mother was at the sink doing dishes, hopefully the right way this time. The kids were bugging me, and I was having a tough time concentrating. So I asked her to make them leave me alone, to which my mother responds with, "What do you want me to do? Put them out in the rain?" And me, being the smartass that I was, and still am, said, "I don't care what you do with them, as long as you make them leave me alone." She didn't like that very much. She rushed towards me, yanked my ass out of that chair, and proceeded to whip my butt for me. Now, my grandma, who's been sitting quietly just inside the living room watching TV, jumps up and grabs the broom.
And we know what that means.
Yep, Sissy yells at my mother, "Don't you ever touch that kid again," and proceeds to chase her outside in the rain while she's beating her with the broom. She's chasing my mother around and around and around the house while she's beating her with the broom and yelling at her. And me, I'm just sitting at the table watching my mother periodically run past the window. And that broom that Sissy's swinging at her is hot on her tail. And I'll admit it, I enjoyed watching my mother get her ass beat after whipping mine for no good reason. Sissy was the only person who ever stood up for me. Oh, sure, Grandpa babied me when I was a kid, but he never stood up for me when I really needed him to as an adult. Family honor and all. So, as you can imagine, Sissy's funeral was a very tough day for me, even though she looked more peaceful than I ever remembered seeing her.
Remember, Sissy was in the throes of Parkinson's with dementia for most of my mother's life.
I remember they dressed her in a beautiful pink nightgown, and she was holding a single pink rosebud in her hand. And all I can remember thinking was, "You're with your mother now."
Now, when we look at pictures of Sissy during the last few years of her life, she looks so tired and worn out.
Yes, she did. And that's why the memory of her looking so peaceful in her casket, it does bring me some peace to know she was no longer suffering from her debilitating illness.
Our half-cousin adds additional info at the end of Sissy's bio about my great-grandfather.
We've included some mild editing for clarity's sake.
Irwin lived many more years in the old home on Highway 34 until a few years before his death. He lived for a while with his son and daughter-in-law, Lawrence and Annie Phillips, in the house that Uncle Lawrence built by the pond before being placed in a nursing home in Ruston, Louisiana.
As for the remainder of our half-cousin's bio, most of it comes from an article written about Grandpa in the Monroe News Star in 1980-ish.
The article includes the following passage: "People were tired of the incumbent Justice of the Peace in 1932 and didn't like him much, Phillips recalls. Lots of folks wanted me to run, but they'd already had the Democratic primary. I became a write-in independent candidate, and more people wrote my name in than those who voted for my opponents. I've been Justice of the Peace ever since. He adds that was the same day that they elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt as president, and the day Louisiana sent Huey Long to Washington as a U.S. Senator. Irwin held trials in the living room of his home, where he presided his entire tenure. Phillips said, honesty and truthfulness have always been his goal. In civil cases where he knows both parties, he said he remains impartial. If the law is on someone's side, I give it to him, he said. It's been 20 years since Irwin has had an opponent, and Phillips sees that as a vote of confidence. He was asked by the last opponent recently if he planned to run again. I said, of course, Phillips replied. When you get a tater, you don't drop it. The job is open to anyone. Anybody can file for it if they want it. As he approached his term, Phillips said, this is the last time he'll serve in the office. I'm not going to run after this. I'll be 93 when the time's out. But so far, age has not been a hindrance in Phillips's duties, according to Fred Redwine, president of the Louisiana Justice of the Peace and Constables Association. That's no easy job he has, but he's a real help to his community, Redwine said. He's a fine old man, and people up there are lucky to have a man of his caliber.
And y'all, Grandpa relinquished his longtime post as Justice of the Peace when his health started to fail. His daughter-in-law, Annie Phillips, served out the rest of his term.
Didn't you used to play with his notary seal?
Yes, I did. When I was a kid, I stamped every piece of paper I could get my hands on, but he never seemed to care.
Unfortunately, we don't know nearly as much about Grandpa's childhood as we do Sissy's.
About the only stories Grandpa ever told me about his early years was the time he first met Sissy in 1903, and when he was 16 years old, he was a school teacher up in Waldo, Arkansas.
He said he came home one day to find his entire family had packed up and left for Texas, leaving him only a note. And he had no idea when he left for school that morning that they were going anywhere.
That's some cold-blooded shit right there.
So it's no wonder that Grandpa didn't talk a whole lot about his family, although he did remain close to many of them throughout the years. My mom tells stories about the trips up to Mena, Arkansas, where Uncle Lonnie lived. He was Grandpa's older brother.
Yeah, we'd make that trek at least a couple of times a year. I really liked Uncle Lonnie. He always had a bag of candy that he'd pass me pieces of on the sly. And if Grandpa knew about it, he never let on.
Grandpa's younger brother, Uncle Clarence, lived near Okaloosa, where my mom went to grade school. She always enjoyed visiting him, too. There were also a few times over the years when they drove down to Victoria, Texas, to see his niece, Lucille.
Our half-cousin talked briefly about Grandpa's JP duties, which included weddings. He says,
weddings were held day and night, which sometimes forced him to wake his wife and children to serve as witnesses.
And once again, our half-cousin forgets about the grandchildren. I was expected to serve as a witness many times. No doubt so did my half-brother and first cousin too.
The ceremonies were simple, he said, with no music. I never could sing, he always said with a laugh. The charge was whatever the couple chose to donate. If they had no money, it was free.
That's true. My grandparents were very generous people. That's why we had so damn many gardens. At harvest time, they fed many people in the community. And when they butchered cows and pigs, they shared that as well. Yes, they had flaws, but their generosity and concern for their community more than made up for those flaws.
Did Grandpa ever have you do anything unethical?
No, but my uncle sure did. He taught me well how to forge people's signatures. And it's a good thing I didn't get that Fuller-McClamey gene for unlawful tendencies. See, at one point, my uncle turned our front yard into a used car lot. He lived with us for about 4 or 5 years between his second and third wives. He'd buy these vehicles, supposedly at auction, but oftentimes the legal owner hadn't signed off on the title. He would, however, have the owner's signature on another document, typically a bill of sale. He taught me how to transfer a perfect signature. Hey, I was a kid, y'all. I didn't know what forgery was or that it was illegal. He, on the other hand, was an adult. He knew what he was doing. Why do you think he had me sign the titles?
He probably figured nobody was gonna prosecute the minor grandchild of J.E. Phillips.
Probably. It's a damn good thing I don't have criminal tendencies. That could have started me down an ugly path. And no, I have not forged anyone's signature since I was a kid and under my uncle's direction, except for Grandpa's signature when I was in high school, and we'd skip school. The next day, we would have to bring absentee notes back explaining why we weren't at school. So I'd forge a signature. But that's all. And now that we've got that out of the way, we'll tell you another story about my grandpa and me.
When my mom was a little kid, around 7 years old, it was discovered quite by accident that she had something very wrong with her. At first, they thought she had leukemia and she was going to die. She was subjected to all kinds of tests that she has thankfully pretty much blocked out.
As it turned out, though, all I had was a very rare disease that made my bones incredibly brittle and easy to break. A pain in the ass for sure, but not fatal. So anyway, after that, my grandfather babies me so much that it made my half-brother and cousin a tad bit jealous of all the special treatment I got.
If my mom didn't want to eat her lunch, Grandpa would take her and her alone to the store and buy her ice cream and candy.
Yeah, I was incredibly babied. They were so happy that I survived, they spoiled me rotten. And I learned early on this was an easy way to get candy and ice cream. Denise, my second cousin, once removed, lived a quarter of a mile down the road, and we perfected that shit too. Uncle Lawrence was a game warden back in those days, so he typically worked on weekends, and his second wife, Helen, would come out to the house on Sundays after church.
During those days, my mom was either at Denise's house or she was at hers. On the occasions when Denise came home from church with my mom, they would pretend to be fighting. So Helen would take them to the store and get them treats, trying to get them to make up.
The first time that happened, we did get into a fight for real. But after that, not so much. I do admit that I was quite an adept little manipulator, and I perfected the art in my teens and 20s. So yeah, I've been very good at manipulating people over the years, although I don't practice it anymore.
Yeah, and it makes her mad now when people try to manipulate her.
Shit, I wrote the book on manipulation. So don't try to think you can pull one over on me. If you manipulate me, it's because I let you. But I digress. My grandfather's physical health failed him, but his mind never did. He was as sharp as a tack until the very end.
He passed away August 6, 1987, in a nursing home in Ruston, Louisiana. He's buried in the Williams Family Cemetery beside Sissy. Uncle Lawrence passed in 2016. He's buried in the Williams Family Cemetery on the other side of Sissy. My grandmother, Florence Evelyn, passed away in 2008. Aunt Catherine passed away in 2013.
All three of them had varying degrees of dementia during their last years and or months. The last time we saw Uncle alive, about a year before he died, he said to me, "You look like you could be related to me." And I said, "I am. And everybody says I look just like you." To which he replied, "Well, you must be pretty good looking then."
He was also seeing my deceased grandmother, his twin sister, during this visit too.
Yep, after he succumbed to the dementia, he was always asking if we knew where to find her. After a while, we stopped telling him that she died in 2008 because each time he'd have to relive her death, and that was hard. Once he was placed in the nursing home after falling and breaking his hip, he saw my mother all the time. And the last time we saw Aunt Catherine alive, less than a year before her death, she was in a nursing home and had been there for a couple of years.
She told us this elaborate story about how one of the nurses at the facility had taken her to church on Sunday, and afterwards they flew to Paris for lunch, and all in her nightgown.
Yeah, and for the record, she never left the nursing home. And as for my mother, I talked to her on the phone about a year prior to her death. She didn't know who I was. Granted, we were not close, so it didn't surprise me or hurt me. I was closest to Uncle Lawrence, but Aunt Catherine and I did have a good relationship the last 15 years or so of her life, so their deaths were much harder on me than my mother's. I am glad that Sara and Stevie got to know their grand aunt and uncle, though. In these days, the countryside where I grew up is unrecognizable. Sissy and Grandpa would be shocked. But my grandparents and the old family tales live on in my memories and now these videos. Okay, so this wraps up the story of my grandparents, Viola Williams and Joseph Irwin Phillips.
Thanks for joining us today, but this is not the end. We'll be back probably in the spring where we'll continue the Blood Tie series with more videos about Sissy and her siblings.
Later, Gators.